And welcome everyone. I'm Allison Harper, the Associate Director of Debate at Emory. Welcome to the second of our 3 webinars being hosted by the Barkley Forum this summer. Today, our panelists will be giving advice to debaters who are not attending debate camp this summer. Each of our panelists will introduce themselves and offer their perspective on ways that debaters can work independently and with their teammates to make the most of their summer. We'll then be answering questions that have been submitted by the audience. I have some of the questions that you submitted in advance during your registration, but if you have other questions, please use the Q&A function in this webinar and I'll relay those to our panel. So let's get started. Ed, you're up first.
Yes, I'm Ed Lee. I'm also with the Barkley Forum. And I'm particularly interested in this conversation because I think this is an interesting topic that will allow for actually a tremendous amount of independent exploration that's very useful to do. And so the first suggestion that I would offer is to jump in and delve into some books. There are a lot of books in talking about crime and punishment and actually the history of the criminal justice system in the United States, that if you are reading those and thinking about it, not just from a perspective of production of debate cards, but from a perspective of understanding the history of criminology in the country, but also understanding the way in which crime, punishment, and race intersects, then it would do you a tremendous amount of good in thinking about how these debates would unfold. That just off the top of my head, right before we showed up, I wrote down sort of 3 books that are sort of recent reads by me, or fairly recent reads, that I think falls into this category. Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, also Stamped from the Beginning by Ibram Kendi, and Locking Up Our Own Crime and Punishment in Black America by James Foreman, actually talks about the way in which this is an issue that falls not just on a question of Republicans or conservatives being in support of crime and punishing crime, but it's actually something that a tremendous amount of Democrats and people who are progressive have done that complicates the way in which we think about this. So read books, think about history, and think about how do you leverage that history as a way of contextualizing what's going on. The second suggestion that I would have is thinking about the topic from a perspective of abolition and reform, that if you can have a cogent and coherent explanation by the end of the summer of a defense of abolishing the criminal justice system, but then being able to deliver an 8-minute speech that then can offer some reasons for why you would just want to reform that criminal justice system instead of abolishing it, then that would position you in a place of being able to have a frame for understanding how the rest of your entire year that is going to unfold, because I think that that's going to be the prism in which most of your debates will fall in. Some people advocate abolishing it, others advocating reforming it, and your ability to have a conversation by the end of the summer in doing that positions you very well. The last suggestion, and then I'll turn it over to Lauren, is I think that theory is ultimately the great equalizer. That when thinking about size of a debate program, how many resources that you have, your capacity to debate topicality and to debate counterplan theory positions you very well to be successful on whatever the topic is, regardless of its particular size. There used to be, and they're still online, what are called debate resource guides that were produced by various debate camps, by various communication scholars that wrote articles about topicality theory, counterplan theory. Go and find those and read those. Also, then subsequently use those to write theory blocks. Why is it that education outweighs questions of ground? Why is it that we should privilege notions of fairness in the way in which we contextualize counterplan theory or topicality theory? Then write some blocks, then rewrite those blocks, and then ask your coaches and ask friends and ask people who have judged you previously if you can get access to their blocks. Not so that you have them, but then you can make comparisons. The final part of this is that I think that you should memorize whatever your blocks are, because the ability for you to have a cogent and coherent debate that's not premised on your capacity to digitally dial up whatever the particular block that you need at that moment is the way in which you become proficient, and this becomes one of the tools that's in your box for doing that. So those are the three suggestions that I'll have for now for how to move forward.
Great. I think I'm up next. My name is Lauren Ivey. I debated for Emory and graduated in 2011, and I am currently the director of debate at Alpharetta High School in Alpharetta, Georgia. So I'm going to talk about a couple additional tips that I think would be useful to you. So one thing you want to do, I think, first of all, is to set a schedule and try to find someone who's like an accountability partner to keep you on track. So for example, when people start exercise routines, they do better, studies show, if they have a buddy who runs with them or encourages them and things like that. It's a lot easier to not stick to the schedule that you make for spending time on debate if it's just you, and it would be more likely that you would stick to it if you have someone else who is kind of doing the same thing, watching the same videos and things like that. So I think each day you should probably be setting a goal that you are reading, cutting cards, speaking, and watching a video, because you want to do what you can to kind of mimic as much of the camp experience as possible, which is what a lot of people will be doing at their camps. The second tip I have is that you should spend time cutting cards on widely applicable areas. So a really good place to start is by reading some of the books that Ed suggested, or just kind of looking at like the topic paper. There's also a really good past topic paper from the college topic on criminal justice reform that would also be a good place to start. So you can spend time looking at those sort of predictable impact scenarios and things that you know people are going to read this year, like DDEV, warming, Afro-pessimism, things like that, and cutting cards that will be useful to you throughout the season. I think one of the advantages of this topic is that I think there will be a relatively small number of impacts that people are going for. A lot of the debates will be about util, they will be about warming, they will be about things that are relatively predictable before the season starts. I also think what Ed said about reading books to sort of get the context through these arguments is really helpful and will help you be able to articulate the warrants in these pieces of evidence more effectively. The last thing I'll talk about is that I think one of the biggest advantages that y'all have right now is that there's so much access to good debates online. The entire TOC was online. There's tons of phenomenal college debates online on YouTube. So as I was talking about before, I think you should find a friend and make a goal of kind of flowing college debates or high school debates on topics so that you can learn both the skills and the content, right? So don't be afraid of watching a good college debate that might be on another topic, because you can see how the debaters are debating and what skills they're using and whether they're being effective or not. And then you can kind of try to act like a judge and make an RFD and discuss with your friend or not if you don't have one, about who you think won the debate. And you need to go beyond I voted AF or I voted neg and kind of look at the warrants and pretend that you are the judge who flowed this debate and has to make a defensible decision that would hold up to a cross-ex or a judge cross-ex from the debaters. You can also compare flows in your RFD with your buddy who is watching the debate as well. And I would definitely start with some of these TOC debates. There are a ton of really good TOC debates from this year online that are pretty good audio quality and would be a really great way to spend your time. I think that is it, so I'll turn it over to Maggie.
Hi, everyone. My name's Maggie, and I'm a rising senior debater at Emory. And I have a few tips as well for improving if you're not going to camp. The first thing that I want to do is echo something that Lauren said about finding a buddy and having some accountability and creating a schedule for yourself. If you can commit even 30 minutes a day to reading books about CJR, cutting cards, or developing skills, you'll end up spending about 40 hours of debate over the summer working, and committing a certain amount of days is something that you can actually sustain during the school year without feeling like you're going to get burnt out on debate work. So creating some sort of goal now during the summer when you have some extra time will be a helpful sort of debate activity that you can take into the school year so that you're continuously improving. The second tip I have is that you should take advantage of the open source camp files and lectures and other resources, but you should also do your own research and kind of go beyond what these camps are putting out. Even though these are great resources, as Ed and Lauren already identified, it's helpful to go beyond what's being put out at camp to see if you can develop interesting arguments or asks that people won't see coming. An advantage that you all have is that you won't necessarily be forced by lab leaders to debate about any particular thing. So this should encourage you to kind of develop your own passions as far as the topic is concerned and create new and innovative strategies. The last thing that I want to emphasize is that you shouldn't be discouraged about not going to camp. Many students don't go to camp and find success in high school and college debate, and committing yourself to get better over the summer will set you up for success by demonstrating that your individual actions and effort can produce great results. And there are lots of ways to find community in debate without going to camp. Your local debate circuit is a great place to start building this community or to look for specific ways to get involved with debate. Reaching out to students that you debate against at local tournaments is a great way to start this. This could be as simple as G-chatting somebody or emailing somebody after a debate saying that you really liked an argument that they read or that you thought that their app was cool. In a lot of places, local circuits are already creating these sorts of community building efforts as well. And building up other debaters in your local circuits creates a healthy and competitive environment where individuals across schools can really support each other, especially in this new online environment where people are going to need to make a little bit of extra effort to kind of create this community. And taking that initiative will be really helpful in doing that.
Hi, everyone. My name is Brian Klarman. I'm the Assistant Director of Debate at Emory, and I'm really excited that we're all here to talk about debate over the summer, even though not everyone can go to camp. But one of my biggest pieces of advice is that you should practice speaking, flowing, and technical skills without a coach, because those are things you can do. Like every day that I have been at a debate camp, either as a student or an instructor, we start the day with doing like 10 minutes of speaking drills. And that's a thing that does not require a lab leader to be there. It doesn't. And even to the extent that many times camps do exercises where you record speeches that you give and then listen back to them to see, are you making background noise? Are you speaking inefficiently? Other things like that. There's like the very long drill that some people do where they listen to a speech, write it down, and then try to take out all of the inefficiencies. Doing those things at camp doesn't actually make as much sense as it does doing them by yourself, because they're not lab leader or coach required. So there are things that I would definitely take advantage of at your environment. And similar to what a few other people have said, you can also be watching online speeches, even if not for the content of them, just to practice flowing. Like so many debates in high school and even in college are won by, can both teams flow and respond to arguments in order? And that's a thing that you can practice without someone else telling you what to do, because you can sit there and go through and flow it. And if you miss arguments, you can listen to the same speech a second time or a third time or a fourth time. And that will kind of get you used to listening to those speeches and debating off of the flow. Two, and Maggie said this, you should also be keeping up with evidence that's coming out throughout the summer. So some camps are going to release evidence packets when their camp is done. Others are going to release waves of evidence as their evidence comes out, and this will be on the Open Evidence Project. It can be really useful to just check in on what is going on, because one of the biggest disadvantages of not going to camp is like you don't have an evidence set when camp ends. But in reality, since so many camps are putting out their evidence, if you are going through that as it comes out, and that's one of your activities that you do every day, so like you spend some time speaking and then you spend some time checking has evidence come out and then compiling it and reading through it and preparing it, by the end of the summer, you're actually going to have more evidence prepared than people who went to camp, which is very beneficial. And I know a lot of people who don't go to camp are also on small squads, so it's useful to be in a situation where it's like, well, I have all the stuff that I need to debate on a small squad because I know what every camp has put out. Like that information asymmetry can be a really big issue that you should try to fix over camp. The last thing I'll say is like keeping up with some specific debate blogs and debate videos is really cool. So like we're doing this, there are a bunch of other people who are doing online free webinars and other things that I would say that it might be worth checking out. There are people who will release lectures and videos and demo debates online that you can definitely watch. Some other things is there are debate blogs like HS Impact and the Wyoming Debate Roundup, for example, where they'll be like posting comments about the topic and talking about debate discussions. And oftentimes they encourage students to email them and they will answer questions in their blog. So those are coaching resources. And basically those are people who work as lab leaders elsewhere. So those are free lab leader resources that you could be getting throughout the summer. Those are kind of my pieces of advice. I obviously am excited to answer some questions we have. And now I'll turn it over to Michaela.
Thanks, Brian. I'm Mikalea Malsin. I'm the director of debate at Georgetown. I graduated from Emory in 2010, right before Lauren, and I'm excited to be here. So a couple of things that I'll say, try not to be too redundant with what others have said, but the first is that it's totally possible to build your own debate camp experience, you know, for as much as it is definitely true that there is not as much downside to not going to camp as you might internally feel, it is also very possible to replicate a lot of that experience on your own, especially now. And so people have spoken to parts of this, and I'll try not to repeat too much, but I would follow the social media accounts for every debate camp on every platform. So every Twitter account, every Instagram account, every TikTok, Snapchat, Yik Yak, I don't know what all the kids are into these days, but everyone that you can find for every debate camp, and you would be surprised how much information will come out, and things like lectures that will be posted, and you can follow along that way and kind of build your own experience in that way. And then as Brian talked about, the Open Evidence Project is a great resource. It's often not fully updated until the end of the summer, but when that does happen, there's something that I think is a really good exercise, whether or not you went to camp, is to go through and kind of organize the file. As Brian, he kind of alluded to this, he said compile the files, and that means kind of constructing your own versions of the work that has been done, which includes a built-in exercise of quality control. So not every card that is produced by a camp is a useful one, and you will end up with a lot of overlap and a lot of kind of background noise that you won't actually need. So going through and picking the best link card for each affirmative, or the best solvency evidence for a counter plan from kind of the array that's been put out over the course of the summer, is both a great way to make use of those resources and to kind of force yourself to figure out what it is that you actually want out of that kind of big compilation. Another resource that I think has been briefly alluded to, and then one that I don't think has, because it's very new, the NDCI website, in addition to the Open Evidence Project, has an open video project, and I think it's not as updated to recent topics or the current topic, but it definitely has some back videos from previous years that are kind of timeless, that have really great advice from a bunch of debate coaches, and including some from this very screen, and has some great stuff that you can check out. And then a more recent initiative is the Digital Speech and Debate Initiative that the University of Kentucky has started, and they have a theory library. To Ed's point about the kind of value of theory debating, you can get a great start in kind of that project by reading some theory articles that have been compiled there. The second thing that I think is, or the second tip that I have that dovetails with stuff some other folks have said, is picking one argument and kind of using this summer to really refine and get good at it. And Ed gave the excellent example of abolitionism versus reformism in terms of criminal justice. I think you could also, pick a topicality argument, or decide that topicality itself is your thing, or theory itself is your thing, or a particular critique. The kind of luxury of building your own curriculum is that you can really dive deep in a way that often camp doesn't give you the sort of space for, because there's a lot of different things going on. And so, read every book that you can find on a particular argument, develop the background, find back files on an argument, and see how it's evolved over time. I think this would be a great summer to kind of really become a specialist in one area, which, as Brian said, if that overlaps with being from a small school, being a specialist in a given argument and knowing every angle of it, enables you to kind of get a step ahead often of even the largest squads that might not know as much as you on that issue. Something I forgot to say also is that, in addition to kind of following along online, I would reach out to coaches that and to debate camps themselves to just kind of ask, like, if there's a particular lecture or a particular drill or exercise or file that's put out that you're interested in. We're all debate coaches because we love debate, and there is no question that a student can ask that we don't kind of want to help with, and so don't be afraid to kind of reach out and see what you can get from people, because I think a lot of people are really excited to help students out, especially if you're like, hey, I didn't get to go to camp, and that's an easy opening for further discussion. The last thing I wanted to talk about is just a little bit of technology, because one of the questions in the that was submitted in advance was about kind of what technology should we know going into a season that will be likely be largely online. I think that this is another area where it's very easy to get practice on your own, because there's various different ways of doing debates online. You know, many of them involve Zoom. So here you are on Zoom right now. You're getting practice on Zoom. That's great. And all it really takes is, you know, an internet connection and a laptop. So, you know, I would definitely say, if I were had this summer, I had some time, set up some practice debates with other teammates, other people you know, and, you know, rope someone in to judge and just give it a shot, you know, see what it's like, what kind of tech problems do you run into, develop a means of communication with your partner, and give it a shot, because I think there's no like one set of exact technologies. And on the last call, I talked about my headset, which I'm very fond of, and I certainly still recommend having a headset, but just the basic practice is one that I think you can definitely get familiar with and will carry across whatever the platform is or the particular version that you'll end up actually debating come fall. So that's what I got.
All right, well, thanks everybody. For the next section of this webinar, I'm going to be taking some of the questions that you all have submitted in advance and posing them to our panelists, but also the Q&A function in this webinar is open. So you are more than welcome to submit additional questions using that feature, and we'll address them as they sort of fit within the topic and as they're submitted. So the first question that I have from the advanced group is, what advice do we have for students who are just finishing their novice year and are looking to advance to varsity, or are a little nervous about debating against more experienced kids?
I think the biggest difference between novice or JV debate and an open debate in high school is the fundamentals have to be like down, and the fundamentals luckily are pretty simple things to get used to doing. So it's like, can you flow correctly is a big question there. Another question there is like, do you have some degree of speed so that you can keep up with what is going on? And then a third big question is just, are you used to giving line by line refutation, where it's like, here's the argument they say, here's our response. Every lab that I've had that kind of is taking a set of people who have debated in novice or JV or in a very local circuit, and they're trying to move to the next level, always starts with like, can you do those basic things? Because if you have the ability to say, they say X, but X is wrong, then you're like halfway toward winning a debate. And then it's just, you know, you want to learn a little bit about the topic from there. And then the background reading tools and other things, I think really start to come in. But I would always, every time you work with someone, it's like, start with the fundamentals, start with the fundamentals, start with the fundamentals. Even the most advanced labs at camp do speaking drills and flowing drills and line by line response drills. And even at the last weeks of camp, when you're at a 7-week camp or a 4-week camp or anything, they're still talking about that, which suggests to me that it's the thing you should practice the most.
I'll add something to that as well. One thing I see a lot in my experience is that students going into their sophomore year do not ever feel ready to go to a tournament. And in the fall, you just have to go and be okay with going 06 or 15 or 04 or whatever, because going to tournaments, even, you know, or online going to tournaments and debating these teams that are better than you or who have been to camp or maybe have a leg up in coaching resources or something is going to make you a better debater. You are not going to be a better debater by going and watching those debates as much as if you go and actually debate and you get feedback from judges. And one of the nice things about national circuit varsity tournaments is that you'll get press. So you'll probably get more say in who your judges are. You may find that their feedback is more helpful in some ways based on the press that you're doing. But even if not, you have to go to tournaments. I cannot tell you how many conversations I have every year with rising sophomores, including some who go to camp for 4 weeks who do not feel ready to debate. But you just have to go. And no one is going to remember your record at that tournament in a year or like 3 months.
The one thing that I would say is to run to the heart of the topic, that commit yourself to debating the best set of arguments at the stasis point of the topic. And don't think about sort of what are the trickiest forms of arguments, what are the things that exist on the periphery that people won't have evidence on. You want your opposition to have evidence. You want them to have the best arguments that are available to them, because you're at a place where you are, as Brian has identified and others have identified here, developing the best set of skills and cultivating your skills. And winning 2 or 3 additional rounds on trickiness means that those are 2 or 3 additional rounds that you haven't sort of been able to sort of hone your iron around how to become the best arguer or the best person to understand explaining a set of arguments. And so that's what I would do. Dedicate to developing a set of arguments at the heart of the topic on both sides of the topic, and ride or die with those particular arguments for the entire year.
Next, we had some questions about developing some particular skills. One of our participants asked for advice for how to get better at writing blocks.
I think the sort of number one piece of advice I have about writing blocks is to write a draft, read it out loud, and see how it sounds to you. And if possible, record yourself reading it so that you can then flow how it sounds, and then kind of come back at it again. Because obviously the idea of a block is a set of written arguments that is pre-scripted to some degree and builds in both your arguments and the evidence that you want to read. And I think that the top mistake that people make, or way in which they could improve, is not thinking through how it sounds to the judge and what they will write down as a result of what you say. And so practicing that and hearing it and doing it again, I think, is a really good way to improve on that. And then the second thing I'll say is a tip that I actually learned from Brian Klarman, who I coached. So that tells you how you're always learning. The first few words of any given tag or argument should, let me rephrase. You should start with a very short version of what you're trying to say. So 3 to 5 words that summarize what you want to say, and then a longer version that's not super long, but is, a more complete sentence to explain and unpack that argument. That's goes along with the same idea about ensuring that the judge can flow the argument and understands what it is that you're trying to say. Because if you just write all of your thoughts in a kind of a block paragraph, that's not very easy to flow. And so those are my thoughts on that.
I would just add that you want to think about writing blocks kind of backwards. So when you're writing blocks for the 2AC or the 2NC, you want to think about what's going to be most useful to you in the 2AR or the 2NR. And I'm sure you might have heard that you should put that at the top of your block. And that's another piece of advice, like making sure that you get to everything that you certainly want in the 2AR or the 2NR. But then when you're going through the process of actually writing the blocks, making sure that everything has a specific purpose and will be as useful to you as possible in the 2NR or the 2AR.
Yeah, and what Maggie's saying, when you write a block, if there is an argument that if the other team did not address it, would it help you win the debate? If the answer is no, the argument should not be in your block. And that's really just the end of it. And like Michaela's saying, you have to compress things into a certain amount of words and get used to some efficient word formats. But when you do that, every time you go through every word and you're like, okay, what does this word add? What does this sentence add? If the answer is nothing, it goes away. If the answer is something, maybe you need to split up one argument into multiple arguments or figure out how you're going to do that. But every word should count.
Our next question is, how can students who are working on their own get better at cross-ex?
So we have a program at Emory that's a part of the BF that's called the Emory Conversation Project. And one of the things that we try to emphasize there, we talk every year at some point, is around the use of powerful questions. And I think that one of the ways that you could do is just try to have a conversation where you are just asking questions, and think about what are ways in which your questions serve to solicit particular information. What are ways in which there are particular questions that could serve to shut down a particular conversation that happens. And I think that you could do that with anyone that you're having, whether it's your parents, whether it's your siblings, whatever the conversation it is. Think about the diagnosis of the types of questions that you're asking and what are the questions that actually lead people to explain particular sets of issues. More importantly, I think that what you could do is to practice what are ways in which you can shift questions to another set of issues. The thing that you find challenging at times is that you have multiple lines of questions that you want, and how do you politely cut someone off? How do you politely transition the conversation to a different set of questions? And that those are skills that we need in a day-to-day basis. So try to have a conversation that is just asking questions of people. And if you can do that and solicit a sufficient amount of information and they feel like they've actually engaged in a conversation, then I think that you're getting better at being effective at doing that particular skill.
I think there are kind of three types of cross-ex questions. There's like, I don't understand something, can you explain it? That getting better at that type of question is really just, you have to be able to admit to yourself what you understand and what you don't understand. And if you're doing the practice reading that other people are suggesting, then you should have some concept of like, I'm hearing this term, I don't know what it means. The second is you're trying to lead someone somewhere. So like you ask a bunch of questions where they basically have a set amount of responses that they can make, and then you have a planned question for each set response. So that means that you have to get used to asking questions that result in a yes or no response or result in a finite number of things that can be said. And practicing those cross-exes isn't about the question as much as it's about what is my next question with each response. And you kind of have to draw out the diagram that's like, I don't know if you all have seen those flow charts. It's like, if yes, then go here. If no, then go here. And then they go on like forever. That's kind of what those cross-exes are supposed to be. You ask a bunch of yes or no, or questions with a finite amount of answers, and you have a plotted direction for where everything goes. The third type of cross-ex is the cross-ex where you don't super care what your opponent says, because really you're like, given that X exists, why do your authors say Y? And like, you don't care what their answer is. You're just trying to say that X thing is true. And you're kind of previewing where your speech is going to go. And the trick with those questions is figuring out how do you phrase those that make them appear both inquisitive and like you are correct. Because no one wants to hear the cross-ex where someone just like declares statements about the world and the other team is like, okay, but ask a question. And also, no one wants to hear where you just kind of ask open-ended questions and have no idea where you're going. So there's like a little bit of an art to framing something as a question that is closer to a statement. But all of these are also based in the realization that your opponent is not going to agree with you. You're not going to be like, given that abolition is better than reform, why did you read this aff? And they're not going to be like, you got us, see ya, we're out.
Yeah,
one last thing I would add. Oh, sorry, Ed. I was just going to add that it's evident in how Klarman explained that you have to think about what your opponents are going to say and what your arguments are in order to determine what will be an effective cross-ex. And so just as you're going through writing your blocks, you want to think about what it would be useful for you to elicit in cross-ex depending on what the other team says, and kind of go through that process of thinking through things in advance.
No, I was just, as Brian was talking again, it reminded me that some of the suggestions that have been made up until this point is about understanding the contemporary and historical context that we're operating from, and that a lot of cross-examinations really is about trying to figure out where there are contradictions between the way in which people are thinking about the world and explaining the world and your understanding of what's actually existing and what's actually occurring. And that if you can frame your questions within an exploration of that contradiction and where it's at, your evidence speaks of this world. How do you harmonize it with these particular other things that are going on? That becomes one way of thinking about cross-examination. It also really demands that you have a grasp of those particular things and where there's a disconnect between them.
Just an example there. Oh, sorry, Lauren, do you want to go first?
No, go ahead. I'll go after.
I was just going to say one example there is like, if you read people who write about abolition, a lot of people have a different definition of what abolition means. So there are some people who are like, abolition, we're going to still have forms where we can criminalize like murderers and say that's bad, or like people who are doing certain crimes, we're going to be like, you can't do that. And then there are some people who write about abolition that's like, there should be no concept of criminality. You are never criminalizing anyone for doing anything. Depending on how they think, what they think they mean by abolition might create tensions between their link and alternative, or link and impact, or alternative and impact arguments, but also give you some direction of where you're trying to go. And it's an example of like, is the background worldview the same as the worldview that they're attempting to describe? Are there contradictions possible? Does it change where the 2AC is going to say things?
I'll just add a couple of things. Most of the panelists, I think, are talking about asking the questions, but in terms of answering them, one of the best things you can do is just know your evidence super well. I mean, there's little that is more impressive in a novice than a novice who can really articulate the warrants in their cards when they're asked about a particular thing, or can explain why their opponent is mischaracterizing the evidence or something like that. So as others have talked about, as you start to like compile and cut cards for the season, making sure that you really know the warrants beyond just like the tag of each card is really helpful in being able to sound credible and answer arguments, and make sure that at a minimum, you're not kind of losing credibility in cross-ex. The other thing I was going to say is that I think it was Matt Liu, wrote an article fairly recently on cross-ex. It's like 10 or 15 pages and pretty detailed. I know Jackie Post from George Mason is kind of organizing a kind of a novice young JV debater set of articles, and so I would be sure to be looking at the article. I thought it was pretty good, as well as other articles online on cross-ex, and kind of critically evaluating them. So do you agree with what this author's saying? Do you not agree, etc.? The last thing is that sometimes my students will feel less anxious, especially if they're novices, if they prepare some questions in advance. And even in the high-level varsity high school debates that I judge, a lot of the cross-ex questions on particular affirmatives are very similar or basically the same, because there's only so many points of tension that people want to clarify, or that they need to set up competition for arguments. So you can kind of start to prepare some of these questions in advance, and then obviously modify them in round as needed.
All right, we've got one last skill development question, and that's, again, for students who are working on their own. How can they get better at giving rebuttals?
I think a good one for this is to debate yourself. So, you know, if you've got yourself, then you have functionally two people, because you can give a speech and then you can debate yourself on the other side, give the next speech, and then progressively, you know, just treat it like a mini debate especially on a given issue. This is really easy, but you can also do it with a full debate where you know, treat it as if you're debating Maverick. Nothing will teach you more than debating Maverick, I think. And so doing it on both sides is, you know, double the fun, double the learning. And so the purpose being to get to the part of the debate that is the rebuttal phase. And so if you set up the constructives, you can probably skip the 1AC and the 1NC, but give a 2AC, 2NC, and then give the 1AR, 2NR, 2AR on a specific issue. I think that is a good way to practice. And again, obviously to do this, you'll need to record yourself and flow yourself, and then flip sides and debate the other way. But I think that is a fun exercise for rebuttal giving.
I think judging rounds and maybe not watching debates that are online and evaluating those rebuttals. And I think that you should write a ballot that's an AF ballot and a neg ballot, like both of those. Based upon these final two speeches, what is the ballot that's for the affirmative and what's the ballot that's for the negative? But also think about, why is it that it's that you can have a ballot for each side, and what are the ways in which it's difficult for you to make a decision based upon the information that gets presented? That the most difficult part that we have to keep in mind, that we are engaged in a communication activity, and what the debaters are saying are not always what the judges are hearing, and the capacity for a judge to process that debate becomes a little bit more difficult based upon a lot of different factors. And the more that you can place yourself in a position that the judge is in as they are trying to evaluate a debate, the better off you are at giving those particular speeches. So I think that that's the suggestion that I'll make. in line with what people have said already, watch debates, but watch the debates from a position of the judge, and watch the debates from the position of how would you make a decision.
All right, next we've got some questions about the upcoming debate topic. Several people asked about various critiques and how they could be used this year, and whether we have recommended readings. Some of those questions were about feminism, settler colonialism, and the abolition critique in particular. Do any of you have thoughts that you'd like to share about those arguments?
It seems like the critiques are going to be pretty important and pretty good this year, largely because the disadvantages are not as good. So I would suggest that, you know, everyone does some background reading. I think a lot of the debate for most of these different lines of criticism is really about, are there times in which prisons or which criminality is an important concept? So whether or not you're talking about the abolition K, which a lot of people who are writing about it are writing from a class and race perspective, or the gender K, they're actually a very similar set of people who are writing about carceral states versus abolitionist states. So like, even if you're looking into feminist literature, you want to be reading about the carceral feminists versus the abolitionist feminists. Michaela just chatted out one of the books that everyone should read, Angela Davis's Are Prisons Obsolete? It is cited in basically every abolition card that you're going to read by basically everyone. So I definitely think that that is a good suggestion. The last thing that I really especially wanted to point out here is you should consider who your critique authors are responding to, by which I mean a lot of the abolition people are responding to the people on the left who are making reform arguments that are like, you know, we should stop doing bad things in prisons, we should be more humane, etc. A lot of affirmatives that you're going to debate might make some pretty core conservative claims like, you know, prisons are too expensive, or we should shrink the size of the federal government. And one of the ways of doing that is by getting rid of prisons or by changing sentencing laws for federalism reasons or separation of powers reasons. One of the like important things that I think is worth considering is that there are some critiques that are less radical than the abolitionists, where you could be saying like, you know, prison reform for economic reasons is problematic. Instead, we should do it for humanitarian reasons. And that is a place where being affirmative is a lot harder because like the AFK answers are really bad to those Ks, whereas like there are some people who write some good answers to the abolition K.
So I've been thinking about this less from a high school debate topic perspective and more from a, here's a moment in time that we're in globally in talking about crime and punishment in our society. And what does that mean for the type of reforms that are being asked for and demanded on the part of governments, and why people make particular choices in how they frame those questions, and what does history tell us about the ultimate consequences to asking the government to make a particular set of reforms in a particular way. And so I am much more on the side of sort of the reading this from history perspective than reading this from any particular philosophical perspective. But even from that read, there's a question that I get left with of what can we remove punishment from our society in total? And if we can't, then what does it mean for who becomes the actors of dispensing particular punishment in a particular way? And so does it, when governments remove themselves from participating within those regimes, does it get privatized in some particular way in ways that we should find more concerning or less concerning? And so starting from that premise of, is it possible for us not to punish, not to sentence? And if it is not possible for us to do that, to expunge that from our society in total, who then becomes the actors, the implementers of justice? And is that net better or net worse in the way in which we process and think about how we exist as a society? And so I go there, like I said, because I'm thinking a lot about that right now. in the ways in which we're asking for particular reforms of the way in which this functions. But I think that you are going to have very similar debates where that becomes the nexus question that you're trying to wrestle with.
Our next question is, it looks tough out there for policy teams next year. What should policy debaters be researching, particularly for the negative?
I'll be quick here because I just said it, that's there. History tells me that when governmental actors reduce their role that they participate in crime regulatory regimes, that ultimately what happens is that becomes privatized, that we can start off with the very notion of the way in which the criminal justice system started in this country with an attempt to regulate slavery, our runaway slaves, by very private actors before it became an instrument of government. And so once we move in that direction, I don't think that it means that we don't punish people. I think that punishment just gets meted out in other ways, in the way in which housing stocks get allocated, in the way in which we redline particular communities, in the ways in which we pass particular laws that become more heightened, more draconian ways of thinking about stand your ground laws and protecting your space. And so I think that becomes more of a internal link turn to the AV kind of argument, without much more of an external DA or external impact to it. But I do think that is a very viable strategy for the negative of people don't just think that crime goes away and it's not something that we have to deal with. There becomes other ways in which they push to deal with it. And I think there are arguments to be made that those privatized forms of violence regulation and regulating punishment is much worse than the regimes that we have now.
I got like 3 2NRs that I would go for every round if I were a team that refused to read the K. One would be T enact means Congress with either the executive counterplan or the court's counterplan. Like, that's just got to be done. The cards, and part of the reason why I think that strategy is so powerful and will be so useful is because all of the actors who carry out law enforcement are executive, not congressional. They're not legislative. The legislature sets the law, the executive carries out the law. So part of what the Obama DOJ was doing was like, prosecutors just aren't going to prosecute people. So what are you going to do about it? And there are questions about whether or not they can do that, but like the negative has fiat. There are plenty of cards that say it's possible. I would be ready to go for that counterplan with like the politics DA. 2 is pardon people. A lot of the different things that this topic is talking about is how to stop people from going into prison. You can just counterplan and be like, let them out immediately. You can categorically grant people clemency. It's not a thing that we are likely to do anytime soon, but there are plenty of people who say it should happen. So I would be ready for that. And 3 is the state's counterplan. Most prisons exist at the state level, not the federal level. The thing you might notice about all of these counterplans is they're all basically different ways of saying Congress should not be the one who's doing the action. Pardons are executive, for those of you who are unfamiliar. So all of them are going to go with the federalism DA or the politics DA or some type of elections DA, or maybe a like executive action reverse elections DA. I don't know, but some type of these counterplans plus these process DAs feels like it's going to be the core policy net ground. I'd also say if you're a policy debater who's like, the policy net ground seems bad, what is there to do? It might signify that the idea that you just go for policy arguments or that you just go for K arguments is going to put you in a bad position. You should be ready to go for all arguments because all arguments exist and they all have strategic utility.
I also think it's worth investing some time in court disads on the negative, because I think a number of people will be reading court asks. I imagine in some ways this topic will be similar to the education topic, and there was sort of a pivot to court asks throughout the year. And the nice thing for the negative about court disads is that there's a number of them, and they're all kind of similar, but they're all sort of different. So you can kind of refine and focus on the ones that you want. I think some of the literature can be confusing if you're a younger debater, but court disads might also be worth considering on the negative.
And then our last question is, what should people be expecting in clash debates? I know we've sort of partially answered this in that a lot of those debates might look like reform versus abolition, but do we have any other insight for anything particular about this topic or what debaters might be doing to prepare for those debates?
I imagine that some people say that we should be talking about the movements instead of the legislative actions that are happening, because there are a bunch of movements that are taking place. You know, there are pluses and minuses to the fact that that stuff is happening all the time. And there is plenty of evidence that says that legal reforms are necessary, especially if you're looking at, you know, a lot of the like Marxist literature or even a lot of the stuff that's happening in the news right now. So I really think the biggest thing is going to be staying up to date with the news, because when people say we shouldn't talk about this topic for X, Y, Z reason, you should be able to have a piece of evidence from today that says we should. It's just like, it seems like a lot of people are claiming that this is currently the most important thing that exists.
Yeah, this is one of those topics that I'm excited that you get to be a part of it because of exactly what Brian said. It's so intricately connected with the now and where we are. And these clash, what we would traditionally identify as clash, is that people are moving in different places and different ways of thinking about how the topic should be explored, and that we haven't come to an agreement about this. The reality is that the mainstream conversation that's happening is, what is the best way of creating durable change as far as the criminal justice system is the way in which it's unfolding. There was a recent writing in Medium by President Obama where he made the argument that what you needed to have is very specific policy proposals in order to hold government officials accountable. There were other people who have responded to him that indicates that no, we're still at a point in time where we need to think about large-scale dismantling of the institution so that we can then come up with a different system, because those reformist approaches have never solved, i.e. Minneapolis response that they're just going to do away with the system. There is a debate that is happening in the question of what do we do and how do we do it in the ways in which we have traditionally thought about it. It's clash debates and debate. And if you're just reading your standard stuff that you read last year and 2 years ago in a way to obfuscate this conversation, I think that you've lost an opportunity to engage in a debate that is happening across the country, across the world, about how do we go about addressing these particular issues.
Okay, that's the end of the questions that were submitted in advance. There's still sort of a last opportunity for any of our attendees if you want to submit a question to our panel.
While we're waiting for that, I just wanted to add one thing to what Ed was just saying. I think the corollary of there is a lot of literature right now is that if you are going for arguments about like why the affirmative has to be topical, I would point out that the place where the negatives are going to disagree with these affirmatives is on the process level, not on the should we have racist police. Like, no one is writing we should have racist police. That is an untenable negative argument. So when you're describing here is what negative strategy on this topic looks like against affirmatives that are not topical, I would have a description that's like, look, 100% of the clash here is about mechanism, not outcome. If you can change the mechanism and do anything that addresses the outcome, like, we're definitely going to lose because everyone agrees that racism is bad and that racist policing is bad, like universal agreement. So we need a topic where there is a very specific mechanism, because you are so correct about the impact, is the way that I would try to frame that if I were negative going for topicality in any of these debates. And honestly, even if you're trying to go for topicality against an AF that's the court's AF and you want to go for T must be Congress, just like, this is only a process debate because you're right about everything else, and it's not fair to make us disagree with them.
Yeah, we're at a place where NASCAR and Black Twitter actually agree on something. That is a part of this debate that you're having. And so it can't be about the terminal impact. It's about, right, it's about the mechanism. How do we get there?
All right, well, there were no other questions, so we're going to go ahead and wrap it up. I wanted to thank everyone for attending and thank all of our panelists for all of their advice about this upcoming year. We hope this webinar has helped prepare you for an excellent experience getting ready for this upcoming year, even though you're not going to camp. We have one remaining webinar on August 9th, and that will be how to prepare for the season once camps have wrapped up. We look forward to seeing some of you then, and I hope everyone has a wonderful summer.